Welcome back to Easily Explained, where today we will be talking about habitat versus niche. So let's get started. An organism's habitat is the area in which it lives in. So we can think of habitat as like an ecosystem because it includes all of the biotic and abiotic factors, which we will talk about more later in the video. But this is like, if you think about it in human terms, the address that the organism has. Whereas an animal's niche is the role that the organism plays in its habitat. And also different ecosystems require different types of niches because the conditions in which it lives and the way that it lives affects the roles that are needed in the ecosystem. So let's look at a couple examples of habitats and niches. So an example of a habitat could be a rainforest. And maybe a desert, a farm, or maybe just home could be considered a habitat for humans. And now let's look at some examples of different niches. So a niche could be the organism's temperature range, how it eats and reproduces, and its place in the food web. So let's just write a couple of those. Like, for example, if we talk about a tertiary consumer, its niche would be to eat the secondary consumers because that is the role it plays in the habitat. So we talked a little bit about biotic factors and abiotic factors, but let's go into more detail about what these two separate factors actually mean and some examples of both of them. So the two terms are actually quite simple. Biotic factors are living things that impact their surroundings. So any organism, anything like that. Abiotic factors are the non-living things that impact their ecosystem. And also it's easy to tell because you can see this root bio is life, so you can think it's alive. Whereas the A in front of it for abiotic, A usually means not. So you can think of abiotic as not living. So for some examples, we talked about biotic factors. Basically any organism. So if we look at like specific examples, we can have a lion, a tiger, pine tree, grass, human, cat, dog. The list goes on and on and on and on because basically any organism, any bacteria can fit in the biotic factor. Now, when we talk about abiotic factors, let's list off some examples. So these are non-living things, like conditional things like temperature, or so then that would include like water, sunlight. If we talk about like rocks, it wouldn't specifically be the minerals found in those rocks, so we can talk about rocks also as abiotic, and then otherwise like soil, air, space. These are all things that are examples of abiotic factors because they're not alive, but they still impact the organism surrounding or its ecosystem, because if there's not enough water, it won't be able to survive. It may need to adapt, and on and on. When we talk about the competitive exclusion principle, this principle basically says that two species cannot occupy the same niche in the same habitat at the same time. So, for example, if two species they have the same place in the food web, since we talked about earlier how that's an example of a niche, is what the organism eats. They eat the same thing. Both species want the same thing, but there's a limited supply of that secondary or primary consumer, or maybe producer. So when both species want that resource, they're going to have to compete for it, because now there's an even more limited supply and it might eventually run out as well. So what would happen if two species occupy the same niche at the same time? If two species are occupying the same niche, one species would either adapt or evolve so that it no longer occupies the same niche. So in that scenario, when we talked about two species that want to prey on the same thing, one would have to evolve to eat something else. Or it could also go extinct from competition. Or it would leave the ecosystem, find another ecosystem, and occupy the same niche but in a different habitat. Congratulations, you are now an expert at habitat versus niche. We hope this video really helped, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!